The first one I'm going to talk about is God's will. Okay, God's will. Now, I will say that when I used to view God's will in a certain way, and when I started studying healing and some other things, I started finding out that the way I looked at God's will wasn't right, okay? And that was a very uncomfortable time for me, because what you believe about God's will affects everything you do. It affects everything you think about. It's just like a foundational paradigm that you view the world through, okay? And so when you start finding out the way I was looking at this is not line up with some of these scriptures, maybe I've been making some wrong assumptions about God all these years, and it's affected my decisions, okay? So if I start talking about this, and this is some stuff you haven't thought about before, it's okay. I'm not asking everybody to agree with everything tonight, but I'm going to present to you what I've come to believe. And to me, once I grabbed hold of what it meant, it's been a profound blessing in my life. Because what I found out was God is not the problem. God is not the problem. I'm not trying to get God to do things He doesn't want to do. What a relief, right? That's a big relief. Okay. So when I start talking about God's will, what I mean when I say that is what God wants, okay? What God wants to happen, what God desires. It would be the same thing if I asked you what your will is, okay? That's what that word means, what you want to happen, what you desire, what you would like. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Now, when I start talking about this, one of the questions that comes up, or the statements people will say, but is going to concern this verse. Sovereignty, okay? Everybody familiar with the word sovereignty? And someone will say, well, God is sovereign, okay? And I believe that. But when I say that I believe that God is sovereign, I believe God is sovereign based on what sovereignty means, not based on a theological tradition, okay? There's a theological tradition that says God's sovereignty means that God controls everything. And that what happens, everything that happens is what God wants, okay? And there's a blueprint that's set out a long time ago and everything's going according to plan, okay? Well, that is not what sovereignty means, okay? And I don't believe that that thing I just said is actually true or biblical, okay? I believe that's very unbiblical. We're going to talk about why I see that. Sovereignty in the dictionary means that no one can tell you what to do if you're sovereign. You don't have to ask permission to do something. So we can say, like, the United States is supposed to be a sovereign nation. That means if we want to lower taxes, we don't have to get permission from some council over the earth, right? We don't have to go ask permission. If we want to give everybody, nobody has to work on Wednesdays. We can do that without having to go and ask a committee about it. The United States gets to make its own decisions without answering to other people. And to the degree that we're able to do that, to that same degree, we are sovereign. Or if you think about kings of ancient nations or kingdoms, a king like Nebuchadnezzar, for example, or somebody like that, that guy is sovereign. And if he makes a rule, then that's the rule. You're not going to say, you can't do that. He's going to say, tough, yes, I can. Right? I'm sovereign. Okay? So when I talk about sovereign, that's what I mean. But if Nebuchadnezzar said, nobody works on Wednesday, that doesn't mean everybody's going to listen to what he said. And if somebody wants to try to sneak around and do some work on Wednesday, he's still sovereign, but people aren't listening to what he wants. Does that make sense? And the way you would know what someone that's sovereign, the way you would know what they want is by what do they say? What do they say about it? And that's the only way you know what they want. That's the only way you know what their will is. Okay? Is this making sense to everybody? Okay? I'm just trying to get some terminology straight because, and this is important if you're talking about stuff like this with people, Because if I'm using a word that means something to me and it means something different to you, there's going to be a lot of confusion, right? So when I say sovereign, I mean you don't have to get permission, right? You are in whatever you're sovereign over, you can do with that whatever you please, okay? Like to a degree, I'm sovereign in my own house that we own, right? To a degree. I don't have absolute sovereignty, but I can say what temperature I want the air conditioning on, and I don't have to ask the town of Apex. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, God is sovereign, totally sovereign. That means there is nobody that he has to ask permission from at all, okay? And he can do whatever he wants to, okay? And so God, if he wanted to, when he's creating the universe, if he wanted to make it so that everything goes exactly how he wants it, and everybody always makes the right choice, and nobody ever sins, and all of that stuff, and everything is perfect, then he could have made the world that way. And since he's sovereign, he can do that, and nobody can say, hey, you can't do that. Right? And if he did that, then there would be no sin, there would be no problems, right? If he wanted to make it like that, right? But nobody would have a choice whether to love him or not, because they would have to, because they wouldn't have the ability to choose not to. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. Okay? And if he did that, he's sovereign. But what if he said, I want to make a universe and have it populated with creatures who can have some level of say-so in how things go? If he does that, he's not any less sovereign, because he's the one that decided to make it that way. He decided, if people have a choice, he decided to give it to them, and he's sovereign. Okay? Does that make sense? But if he gives someone a choice, and that's a real choice, then by definition, he is limiting his control over that person. Right? Because if he gives them a choice, he has to say, I'm not controlling which way you go. So to whatever degree they have choice, to that same degree, he is limiting his own control. No one's taking it from him, he is limiting it himself. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay? This is very important. All right. So and once you see this is all over the Bible, almost on every page, that God's will doesn't just automatically happen. Sometimes God's will doesn't happen. Okay? So let's start at the very beginning. God said, Adam and Eve, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay? Now, what is God's will about the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Don't eat it. That's his will. Is that right? Right. Did his will happen? It did not. They ate it. He told them not to because he knew what would happen if they did. And the way he worded it is like, don't do it because if you do, you'll die. And he didn't want them to die. He didn't say, if you eat it, I'll kill you. Right? He didn't say, that's not in there. If you eat it, you'll die. You're going to mess yourself up. Okay? So right from the get-go, God said something, and that was his will. The only way I can know what God's will is, I can't look at what happened, I have to look at what he said. That's really the point of this. Okay? If God says, I want things to go this way, but things go this way, then I am not allowed to look at that and say, well, I guess this was God's will, not what he said. Is that making sense to everybody? So if God said, I'm going to take some really obvious ones. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Is that God's will? Right. How do we know that? Because he said so, right? But does that ever happen? That hardly ever happens, right? So there's a lot of places. Or God said, don't commit adultery. Or don't kill each other. Don't gossip, right? A whole bunch of stuff that he told us, here's how I want it to go, but if people don't cooperate, it doesn't happen. Okay? And not only people, but angels. Angels have a choice because some of them chose to rebel. Right? That's how we have Satan. God did not want Satan to rebel because God is not the author of evil. Right? God does not cause anyone to be evil. Hopefully that's not news to anyone, right? Are y'all tracking with me so far? Okay. Now, or let's say, like in Ephesians chapter 5, it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Does that always happen? No. But if a husband is being mean to his wife and I see that, and I've been praying for their marriage, I can't just say, well, I guess it wasn't God's will. Right? I can't blame someone's sinful behavior on God, is what I'm saying. Right? And if someone's rude to me at work, I can't say, well, I guess it was God's will. Because God's will is that we love each other as we love ourselves. So really, the end result of thinking about this is to come to the realization that I cannot look at circumstances and situations to find out what God's will is. I have to look at what did He say. And if what He said doesn't match what I'm seeing, then what I'm seeing is not His will. And I'm telling you, this is so liberating. Because like I said, if I'm having trouble in my life, I can't blame it on God. Especially if it's the result of my sin or someone else's sin. Right? Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and life abundant. Anywhere my life is not abundant is not God's will. That's what's so awesome about coming to realize that God's will doesn't always happen. Okay? If God's will always happens, why are we even praying in the first place? Right. I can't mess it up because His will is going to happen. And so if I've had someone come to me and say, well, I don't believe that, and I say, well, if you think God's will always happen, then it's God's will that I don't believe that. It's His fault I believe the way I do. Right? That's not as funny to you guys as it is to me, I can see. Okay, so the point here is, if I want to know what God's will is, I have to look at what He said, not what's going on.